So, do you enjoy playing overpowered characters who are clearly mechanically superior to every other character in the game? Well, today we're going to be talking about the Fighter class in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of the Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists. My name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller who knows just how terrified you are of being disarmed. Welcome to my channel where we talk about role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today I am starting a new series that I call Classic Introductions. Think of this series as introductory videos to the various classes in RPGs to help you get a handle on what the classes are and what the classes have to offer players at your gaming table. I'm going to be starting this series looking at classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and in particular I want to kick off this series by looking at what are easily the four most iconic character classes in any fantasy RPG: the Fighter, the Rogue, the Cleric, and the Wizard. These classes represent some of the most iconic character types that you can imagine in a fantasy role-playing game, and I think that they serve as a perfect springboard to looking at what classes are and what classes have to offer. So today we're going to be looking at the Fighter class in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and we're going to be answering 5 questions in specific. First, what is the Fighter class? Second, what are the strengths of the Fighter class? Third, what are the weaknesses of the Fighter class? Fourth, what are some of the character build options for the Fighter class? And last but certainly not least, what are some things that I can do to get the most out of the Fighter class in my game? These videos are intended to be introductory, so we're not going to be deep diving every aspect of the Fighter class today, but we're going to be looking at these questions in general to help us understand what the Fighter class is and how we can use it in our Pathfinder 2nd Edition games. So, let's get started. Our first question today is, what is the Fighter class? And we're going to be looking at 3 specific things every time we evaluate a class. What is the primary character role of the class? What is the overall complexity of the class? And what are the key terms or key ideas that we need to be aware of if we're considering playing that class? Now, overall, this is how I would describe the Fighter. The Fighter is a somewhat bland but very effective martial class that is focused on offense more than defense, and it allows a very deep level of tactical play, but it can be a little bit difficult to approach due to the overall complexity of the class. Let's break this down. First, in terms of the class's role inside the game, the Fighter is basically the archetype of what a martial class is and should be. When you think of martial classes, you think of the characters who are going to get in close and personal with the monster, and they're going to rely on physical skills and weapon ability to take that monster down. They don't rely on magical abilities, they rely on pure martial skill to take down monsters and overcome obstacles. And the Fighter class is 100% the class we think of when we think of martial characters. It is the definition of what a martial class is and should be. But in examining Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I do want us to be a little bit more specific about the Fighter's role inside the game, because honestly, roles like martial character can cover a lot of different play styles. And when we examine a playstyle, we really want to know what we're getting into. Well, of the various martial classes inside Pathfinder 2e, the Fighter distinguishes itself as one of the best offensive classes in the game, and in particular, it is an offensive class that focuses on accuracy. The Fighter is the class that you want to play if you want to land hits. And we'll talk about this later, critical hits. The Fighter is not concerned so much with damage output as it is damage reliability. On top of that, the fighter is a very tactical class in Pathfinder 2e with a lot of in-depth and nuanced options for what it can and should do on the battlefield. So, if you want a character that is very tactical, that can implement these amazing plans during a fight, and most likely execute those plans with a high level of reliability, the fighter class is for you. But one of the things I would caution people if you're looking at the fighter class is this is a particularly complex class. In fact, of the non-spellcasting classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Fighter is arguably one of the most complex. In fact, I want to give the Fighter an overall complexity rating of 7 out of 10. This class is definitely more complex than a lot of the other martial characters that you might play, and if you want a quick visual reference for why I say the Fighter class is so complex, you can look at the key terms that Paizo wants us to know when we're dealing with fighters. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Paizo has done players a huge favor by creating sidebars that kind of show us the important rules we need to know when we play particular classes. They highlight the key terms. And the fighter class comes with 4 key terms in the class description alone: flourish, open, press, and stance. And we'll talk about this in a second. I say that there is a 5th concept fighters need to be aware of, which is weapon traits. But those first 4, flourish, open, press, and stance, fighters are actually tied for the most key terms of any class in the game. Fighters and monks, they're the top 2. Now, I think it's debatable whether fighters or monks are more complex, but let's just go ahead and say, out of the gate, fighters already have some serious complexity built into the class. Really quick, here's what those terms mean. Flourish, you can basically think of that term as meaning once per round. Flourish abilities are abilities that require so much energy, so much effort, or so much complexity in their use that regardless of what combination of actions you get, you're only going to get one of them around. If you use a flourish ability, you can't use it again that round, and you can't use any other flourish abilities as well. The next term is open, and you can think of open as a trait that just means opening move. These are special abilities that fighters have that they have to do first in a given round if they want to use them. Technically, you can do things like move before you take an open action, but once you have taken an open action or any other attack action, open actions are off the table for the rest of the round. Press actions are actually the opposite of that. You can think of press actions as follow-up attacks. So you can't start with a press action, but if you've used another attack in the round, then you can follow it up with a press action. Finally, you have stances. And stances are special actions that you can only use during combat that basically allow you to adopt a particular style, a particular stance, or a particular strategy during that fight. Once you've used a stance action, you get particular bonuses, and you can't take any other stance actions until at least the next round. So, those 4 key terms pop up as soon as you start reading the fighter class, and like I've said, they're tied for the most key terms of any class in the game. But on top of that, when you're looking at the fighter, I would argue weapon traits is another set of rules that you want to be aware of. Why? Well, fighters are martial characters. And Paizo, I love you, you did a lot of great work on Pathfinder 2e, but man, there are a lot of weapon traits in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. There are a lot of weapon traits, and almost every weapon has at least one, if not two or three traits that impact it in play. Now, obviously, every character is going to be impacted by weapon traits to a certain extent, but fighters are defined by their martial skill, so weapon traits are a big deal for fighters in a way that is not as impactful for other classes in the game. So, I know that was a ton of material, but the takeaway from this is fighters bring a lot to the table. They're effective, they're very accurate, and they allow for a lot of tactical options inside the game, but there is also a lot that you have to keep in mind and juggle and consider when you're playing a fighter. If you are coming from other fantasy role-playing games, the Pathfinder 2nd Edition fighter might catch you off guard. In Pathfinder 1st Edition, if I had a brand new player at my table, I often recommended the fighter as a good class to learn that particular game because it was a very straightforward class. Sure, you could make complex versions of the fighter in that game, but overall, it was usually a very simple class, and if you're trying to learn the game, there wasn't a particularly steep learning curve to be able to play a fighter well. And I feel like a lot of fantasy RPGs, that's kind of where fighters are. They are a pretty simple class. Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that is not necessarily the case. If you're looking at this class, they are one of the more complex martial classes that you can play. So that is definitely something you should keep in mind. Now, before we go any further, I do want to stop and make a quick note here. On any of these class videos, when I point out a strength or a weakness, when I point out a positive or a flaw of a given character class, I am trying to give you information to make an informed decision about how the class plays. But more than the strengths and the weaknesses and those different things, if there's one thing I have learned about role-playing games, it is the character that excites you is the character that you want to play. When I talk about the complexity of the fighter, there is a lot of complexity here, but if the fighter excites you, if you look at it and you're like, man, I've got a lot of ideas, this is compelling, I think this looks fun, go for it, even if you're brand new. If you're excited, that gives you motivation to learn, and I guarantee you motivation is going to beat the difficulty curve. I want to give you the information to make an informed decision about your character, but please don't let any particular note or criticism of a class dissuade you if the excitement is there. The fighter is a complex class, but it can definitely be a lot of fun. So let's move on to the second question. What are the strengths of the fighter class? Well, I've already talked about this. The fighter is a martial class, so we know it's going to be good in combat. But more than that, it is a class that focuses on offense over defense. When you're considering the character that you want to play, if you are looking for a character that is more aggressive, more offensive, more willing to take the fight to the enemy, the fighter is probably going to be a good class for you. One of the key strengths of the fighter class is they start the game proficient in every single weapon, and they actually have expert proficiency for the vast majority of weapons in the game. On top of that, fighters actually get master weapon proficiency for most weapons at 5th level, and by the end of the game, fighters have legendary proficiency with most of the weapons that they can possibly encounter and pick up. Fighters are, by and large, ahead of the curve when it comes to accuracy in combat with almost any weapon you can imagine. That is an incredibly powerful advantage. So when you're looking at fighter, the number one strength you need to know about the class is they're going to hit. If you're looking for a character who can reliably land their blows, fighter is the class for you. And to push this point a little bit farther, because of the critical success and critical failure system inside of Pathfinder 2e, fighters are the class that is the most likely to land critical hits during the game. So if you're a player who really enjoys fishing for critical hits, Fighter is also a class that might be a lot of fun for you. Now, Fighters definitely focus on offense over defense, but it doesn't mean that they are terrible at defense. They definitely have some solid defensive options. They are proficient in all of the armors in the game. They're going to start with the shield block reaction. And while they don't have the highest possible starting hit points, they definitely start with a solid number of hit points. Finally, Fighters start at expert proficiency with fortitude and reflex saves. So 2 of the 3 saving throws in the game, they start at expert proficiency. That's pretty strong. They're not as strong with will saves, but they do get the bravery ability, which kind of offsets that slower will save progression. So Fighters are not terrible defensively, they just focus on offense more. Another area where Fighters are stronger than you would expect is perception. Like, that's something that actually surprised me when Pathfinder 2nd Edition came out. I normally don't think of Fighters as the perception characters in a game, but Fighters start with expert proficiency in perception, and they get master proficiency eventually. And since perception is the most common initiative in Pathfinder 2e, Fighters actually eventually get a bonus that allow them to function as if they were legendary in perception when rolling initiative. So Fighters end up better at perception than you might expect when you first come into the game. However, if I had to pick 2 other true strengths of the Fighter class, I would have to go with action economy and combat flexibility. Fighters have some of the best action economy in the game. When I have tried to push the action economy of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the 2 classes where I've really seen the most in being able to push that system are the Fighter and the Bard. These are the top 2 classes in really pushing the action economy of the game. If you like the 3 action economy that Pathfinder 2nd Edition uses, the Fighter class is going to get a lot of mileage out of that system. And a really good example of this is Fighters are the only class that start with the attack of opportunity reaction. Yes, there are other classes in the game that can get attack of opportunity, but Fighters are the class that start with it. And this means right out of the gate that Fighters are one of the best classes at having a reaction to use. Seriously. If you dive into the class feats, the different actions that Fighters have, the different reactions that Fighters have, there are just a ton of options available to Fighters, and if you really want to get the most out of the action economy of Pathfinder 2e, Fighters are going to take you the distance. Another thing that I really appreciate about Fighters is they are one of the most flexible classes in the game. We're going to come back to this in more detail on the 5th question in this video, but I want to highlight the combat flexibility and improved flexibility class features that the Fighter gets. Basically, every day the Fighter just gets 2 extra class feats that they can use that day. They can train themselves up in whatever it is they want to do. And so if your Fighter is going up against a particular challenge or a particular monster that you're not normally specialized in taking down, if you're a high enough level Fighter, you can just pick up 2 class feats that help you focus in on what you need for that encounter, and you can switch this up every day. Combat flexibility and improved flexibility are phenomenal class features. If you play smart, you can get a ton of mileage out of these 2 options. So, what are the weaknesses of the Fighter class? Well, If you read the internet commentary on Pathfinder 2nd Edition, most people are going to probably tell you the fighter class doesn't have weaknesses, they're broken, overpowered, and they break the game. If you want to feel like a god in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, fighter is the class for you. We can skip this question. Okay, obviously I'm being sarcastic, but as a serious note, I want to say I don't think that the fighter is broken. The fighter, to quote Wolverine, is the best at what it does, but that doesn't mean that the class doesn't have some weaknesses. First off, from a metagaming perspective, the class is very tactical and it has a ton of options, but having a ton of options can be somewhat overwhelming. If you look at the fighter feats in just the core rulebook, at least 80% of the class feats for fighter either have a particular action icon or a reaction icon, or build on a class feat that has an action or reaction icon. Almost everything the class does is focused on combat, and there is definitely a lot of complexity. Tactics are an ever-changing branch of the game, and it is easy to get overwhelmed. As I mentioned earlier, it's not the most new player-friendly setup for a class. Also, this should go without saying, but the base fighter has no magical abilities. If you're looking for magical options, you're only going to get them through multi-classing or other special rule elements inside of the game. The base fighter does not give you any magical options to work with. And the final category of problems with the fighter class is it's a really generic class, just to be honest. They didn't bake as much flavor into the fighter as they did other classes inside the game. And don't get me wrong, the class is effective, but if you're a new player trying to develop a character concept, you're probably going to have to do a little bit more work to flesh out the character if you're going to play a fighter. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to consider. However, it does have a little bit of an impact on overall gameplay in that it's a little bit harder to specialize a fighter. If you're trying to specialize towards a very particular build, the fighter can easily get outshined by another class. For example, there are a lot of fighter feats that are duelist feats, you know, the one-handed rapier wielding fighter concept. And it's certainly an effective concept, but the swashbuckler class from the Advanced Player's Guide kind of outshines it. If you're looking for a strong tactical class, the fighter is great, but it's kind of generic, and if you're building towards something very specific, other classes may present a better option inside the game. Now we come to character build options. What are my options if I play a fighter? And this is actually one of my main criticisms of the fighter in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The fighter does not have any defined subclasses. And Paizo actually said that was a specific design decision that they made when they did this game. Fighter doesn't have subclasses, it's not going to get subclasses. It is intended to be a very generic blank slate style of class. If you ask me, I really wish that Paizo had gone the direction of the soldier class from Starfinder, which does have defined subclasses and in my mind is the best executed version of a fighter in a TTRPG ever. But we'll leave that conversation on the side for now. Just because the frame of the class is generic, that doesn't mean that there aren't particular options you can kind of zero in on. Over here, I'm going to pop up some rough build concepts you might be able to use with the fighter class, and for each one I'm going to try to offer an example feat that you can get fairly early in the game that would go with that build concept. First up would be a two-weapon fighter, dual-wielding weapons, and a good example of a class feat that supports that archetype is Double Slice. You could also play what I would call a precision fighter who really wants to drive the accuracy of the class as far as possible. A good example of that build might use a class feat such as Exacting Strike. Fighters do not have to be a purely melee-oriented class. You can do ranged builds for this class as well with an archer or thrown weapon fighter. The Advanced Player's Guide really added some good thrown weapon options. And you can look at class feats such as point blank shot or rebounding toss if you're interested in a build like that. You could also go for what I might call a brute fighter, the fighter who relies on massive two-handed weapons to deal an incredible amount of damage, and the classic class feat for that would be power attack. There's also the old, trusty, and very reliable sword and board, or sword and shield fighter, which can be particularly strong in the reaction game with feats such as reactive shield. There is also a build that you might term the maneuver fighter, which focuses on using special maneuvers like grapple and shove, and deliberately keeps one hand open so that they can do those actions frequently inside combat. A good example of that build might use the snagging strike class feat. One of my favorite archetypes is what I call the blitz fighter. Basically, you're doing the Cobra Kai strategy, strike first, strike hard, no mercy sir. Get in and do as much damage as fast as you can. A good example of this build would use the sudden charge class feat. I referenced it earlier. There is also the classic rapier-wielding duelist fighter, and they might use something like the second level class feat dueling parry. Another build, I swear I'm not just stealing NASCAR names for, is the Intimidator, that focuses on using skills like Intimidate to inflict penalties on their opponents during combat. They have access to options like the second level class feat Intimidating Strike. And then the most recent class build option that I've seen Paizo start to support is what I'm going to term the Tactician, which uses feats like Combat Assessment from the Advanced Player's Guide. Now, I will be honest, the Tactician style build using just Core Fighter I don't think is fully supported yet, but it does seem to be an option that Paizo is trying to put into the game, and I think we're going to see more for that build as more supplements come out. Now, I know that was a lot of options that we just flew through really quickly, but one of the great things about martial classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is quite often you can dip into at least two of these options and be effective in two different fields. Sometimes you can even do three of them effectively, especially if you're using combat flexibility and improved flexibility that we talked about earlier. So when you look at these different ideas, realize you don't have to dedicate to just one. But now we come to what is probably the biggest question that we can ask: how can I get the most out of the fighter? One of the good things is, because their accuracy is so high, fighters are already a class that's going to be pretty effective. You're probably going to hit, you're probably going to land more critical hits than everyone else, so you're probably going to be effective. But there are some things that you can do to really get a lot out of the class. Number one, weapon choice is very important. Remember when I talked about weapon traits earlier? Take a look not just at how much damage your weapon deals, but what traits your weapon has and how that's going to affect what is available to you in play. I won't go into all the options here, but as a simple example, many weapons in Pathfinder 2nd Edition have the Deadly trait, which adds bonus damage on a critical hit. Fighters are more likely to land critical hits, so weapons with the Deadly trait are probably going to be more impactful for your character. That's a simple example of how looking at those traits and considering your weapon selection carefully can help you get a little bit more out of the class. But really and truthfully, when it comes to getting the most out of the fighter, what you need to understand is the blank slate phenomenon. Fighters are a generic class. They are a really good base on which to build something truly unique if you are willing to put in the effort. The fighter can go so many directions that you really have to take the time and ask yourself, what direction do I want to go and how do I best get there? Wandering around aimlessly with the fighter may result in a character that is less effective at the gaming table and less enjoyable to play. You have a blank slate. You can do anything you want, but carefully consider what you're going to do so that you can make sure to get the most out of the character you're playing. For an example of this, let's talk about skill selection. Fighters actually have a lot of flexibility when it comes to skills. Fighters start the game with either athletics or acrobatics, their choice, and then they get 3 additional skills plus their intelligence modifier. That means, at the very least, a fighter with a starting intelligence of 10 is going to have 4 skills to choose from, not including their background. And really, as a fighter, your field is wide open in terms of what you want to do. Think about what skills you want to bring to the table, because there's not a lot of skills that you have to have. Now, between athletics and acrobatics, if I could offer a recommendation, you probably want athletics. Acrobatics is good, and if you're playing a fighter that uses dexterity, I would definitely pick it up. But athletics is going to allow you to push those special actions I've mentioned before of grapple, shove, disarm, and trip. If you want to use those special attacks, you definitely want to make sure you have access to athletics. So between those two, that is definitely my first priority. But from there, the skills you take is really wide open to the character you want to build. A strong choice for fighters, in my opinion, is the crafting skill, and if you're playing a sword and board fighter, the crafting skill is almost a necessity. The ability to repair your shield and repair your weapons can be very, very powerful inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Don't overlook the crafting skill. From there, I basically only have 2 generic categories that I can push you towards: the charisma skill and the recall knowledge skill. One of the classic tropes of combat-oriented characters is the intimidation skill, and that is definitely a solid pick for fighters. If you want your character to be able to offer something in social situations, being able to growl convincingly can definitely give you some role-playing options, but don't just limit yourself to intimidate. There are several useful charisma skills inside the game, so diplomacy, deception, and intimidation are all good options, and as a fighter, you've got the skill selections that you could easily invest in any of those 3 to allow you to not just be effective on the battlefield, but also in the social scenes and the intrigue scenes inside your game. Another thing that I would strongly recommend is use one of your fighter skill selections to pick up a recall knowledge skill of some kind. Paizo has done a good job of making recall knowledge valuable in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and since fighters don't have a lot of stuff that they have to focus on, you have the flexibility to pick up a skill that lets you recall knowledge about foes that you might be facing. So if you know that your campaign is going to feature a particular foe quite frequently, then pick up the corresponding skill that will allow you to recall knowledge about those opponents, and you will be able to better prepare for the challenges in your game. Really and truthfully, fighters are wide open. I've just skimmed the surface. You can really go any direction you want, but think about the direction you want to go and focus and get there. Another strong example of the blank slate phenomenon applying to fighters is, in my personal opinion, fighters are the best class if you want to do multi-classing in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In Pathfinder 2e, multi-classing is now covered by archetype feats, where you trade out some of your class feats to pick up abilities from other classes. It is a brilliant system, I really love it, can't deep dive into it here, but overall, if you're looking at multi-classing, martial classes are often the best base frame for a multi-class build, just because martial classes tend to get more class feats. If you have more class feats, you have more opportunities to switch them out for multi-class archetype options. Pretty simple math there. But fighters have access to the combat flexibility and improved flexibility class features, which are basically 2 free class feats every day in-game. Now, technically, you cannot use combat flexibility and improved flexibility to take archetype feats. That's not how they are used. But since the fighter basically has 2 extra class feats every day, the fighter can take 2 archetype feats with basically 0 opportunity cost as compared to any other martial in the game. And if you're playing a human fighter, you can push archetypes even farther, again, without really sacrificing anything that the base fighter class is going to have to offer. So if you are looking at archetypes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, fighter is the perfect class to staple an archetype onto, whether it is a multi-class archetype or an archetype for an organization inside the game world. There are a ton of cool archetypes in the Advanced Player's Guide alone. If you are looking at archetypes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the fighter is just the perfect blank slate to staple an archetype onto. So one of the best ways to really get a lot of mileage out of the fighter is to kind of look at some of the archetype options inside the game, because there's not a lot of opportunity cost to make use of those archetypes, and it also kind of helps with the generic flavor that the fighter has. Archetypes really can help push your fighter in whatever direction you might want to go. Now, my final tip is a quick tip, has nothing to do with blank slate phenomenon. This is just a good rule for any character in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Don't skip out on consumable items. Consumables are a lot more important in Pathfinder 2nd Edition than they were in the previous version of the game, and honestly in a lot of versions of fantasy RPGs. Consumable items really carry a lot of weight in this game, and Paizo has developed what are essentially martial character specific consumable items called talismans. They were put in the game so that martials have consumable items that were meant for them. Wizards have scrolls, well, now fighters have talismans, and they do carry a pretty good punch, so don't forget you have access to those options. Fighter is a very effective class, so when it comes to getting the most out of the class, the main thing you want to do is just be deliberate about the direction you're taking your character. Know where you want to go, know which options are important to you, and figure out what skill selections, what class feats, maybe even which archetype feats are going to be the most helpful to that build, and kind of set your sights on that early. If you do that, Fighter is going to be an excellent base to help carry you to whatever concept you might want to play. But those are my thoughts on the Fighter class. Now it's time to turn the conversation over to you. What do you think of the analysis that I have given the Fighter class for Pathfinder 2nd Edition? Do you agree with my assessment? Do you feel that there is something on the Fighter class that I missed? A strength that I overlooked, or a weakness that I failed to highlight? Do you have your own ideas for builds that you can make with a fighter, or ways to get the most out of the Fighter class? Leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it, subscribe to the channel, be a part of the conversation that is ongoing. And if you have any particular questions that you would like me to consider when I get to other classes in this series, definitely let me know, and I will try to work those into my videos as well. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a wonderful day.